In this video, we're going to be going over how light bakes work inside of Modo. So when we do light bakes, there's usually kind of two different schools. One of them being baking lights directly onto textures, existing textures, and using those to kind of enhance your existing textures, kind of like we did with ambient occlusion bakes, and that's what we're going to be doing in this case. But the other method for using light bakes is to actually have a big, huge environment with a bunch of different props in it, and then you bake the lighting so you don't have to have a bunch of real-time lights lighting the room. It's just the room is always lit how it is, so you bake all that lighting in there instead of having it real time. So let's get into this real quick. The first thing that we're going to do is, again, this is just our same helicopter file. So there's just the low poly helicopter, directional light, camera, and then the shading tree. We have that ambient occlusion output. We really don't need that, so we'll just turn that off. So similar to the ambient occlusion bake, we're going to need a new output over here. So I'll just go ahead and duplicate the final color again. And again, I don't technically need one of each of these. You could also just kind of change your, normally when you open it, there's just an alpha output and a final color. You could just change the final color to an ambient occlusion, do your AO bake, change it to a light one, do your light bake. But just so you guys can kind of see everything at the same time, I just have these all up. So I have two final colors, this one with a little 2 on it. I'm actually going to change this one. So again, I just click on this little down arrow right here, go to lighting, and the one that I want is illumination total. That's going to take all the lighting in the scene into consideration when it does this bake. So the first thing that I consider that I have to change would be the actual lighting in the scene. So just like when we're getting our renders prepared and changing lights around, what we're going to do is go right into perspective up here in the top left, or whatever view you're currently in, go to light and go to directional light. So at this point the light is shining kind of down on the object's right side. So where we want to position this camera is actually kind of right above it, right in front of it, and kind of down at a 45-degree angle, so something about like this. So if I jump into the setup tab, just hit A so I can see everything in the scene. I have my, go to item mode, click on that. So the little blue light, you can, or the blue tail on the light, excuse me, is going to be where this light is kind of pointing from. So it's going up this way, down. So we're pretty much down at a 45-degree angle in front of the helicopter itself. So if we were to bake this out now, it would pretty much, as you can see here, the front top of the helicopter would be lit really well. The back and the bottom wouldn't be all that lit. So let's go ahead and go back to the modeling tab. I'm in the directional light. I don't want to really move this light around. I want it to stay about right here. So I'm going to go to directional light and switch to perspective. So kind of the methodology that we're going for is most things, when you see them in the real world, are lit most likely from the top. So if you walk by a helicopter sitting on the ground, chances are the sun's going to be shining in the air somewhere, or if it's a cloudy day, overall this top kind of 180-degree hemisphere is going to get the most light, and the bottom 180-degree hemisphere is going to be kind of a little bit less light, or it's going to be just not as bright. Again, that's not true if this helicopter were to do a barrel roll or something like that, but the majority of the time you're looking at anything, its upright area is going to be a lot lighter than the kind of bottom area of it. So we already have one light over here coming down, so what we're going to do is add another light over here coming down this way, and that'll kind of give us that whole hemisphere. And realistically, you could, if I go to the top view, I could have a light here, here, and here, kind of like 3 different ones spread across, all pointing down at it. I could do 4 total. I can pretty much do whatever I want to do with lights. I'm going to keep it kind of simple at first and just do one here and one here, both facing down at our object. So to get this second light in the scene, what we're going to do is we have our first light right here. So what I'm going to do is just right click, go to duplicate, and hit this little top one. So now you can see there's 2 different lights in the scene. So if you duplicate something, what's going to happen is it's going to be kind of the same thing sitting on top of the original one. So if you look at the front of our helicopter, now you can see it's a little bit lighter on the front. So if I was to turn one of these lights off, it's a little bit darker, turn both of them off, now it's kind of unlit in a sense. So now what we're going to do is take one of these lights. So again, we have 2 lights that are the exact same sitting on top of each other. I'm going to take the second light and move it over here looking down this way. So to do that, I'm just going to go into perspective, grab my light 2, again, looking in the same way, and I'm just going to spin it around this way and just try to line this up towards looking at the back. And again, if I'm over a little bit this way, over a little bit this way, it's not really that big of a deal. Ideally, you want it to have it as centered as possible. Because again, if I go like this, now I can see, oops, this whole portion of the front of the helicopter, and I can't see any over here, so chances are this is going to be a little bit in shadow. So getting a little bit more even is your best bet. So something like that should be fine. So I'm going to go out of directional light, hit perspective. Actually, just jumping back to the setup tree, if I look here, we have this one. It's up a little bit higher than this one, so if I wanted, I could just in item mode bring it down. And again, to get into item mode, you can either hit 5, that puts you in item mode, kind of like 1, 2, 3 puts you in vert edge polygon mode, and then I can select my object. Or up here, if I hold this little down arrow, you can see that I'm just in part mode. So if I just click on part, so I'm in that mode, then I can click on any of these objects. So again, I can make these as equal or not as I want. So from here, what we can do is go ahead and just do a test bake. And I'm just going to call this a test bake because there's a few settings that we have to change. So there's really, I just know from preemptively doing this that the bake isn't going to turn out all that well, but we can at least get a good idea of what's happening. So again, final color's off, AO's off, alpha output's off, just this illumination total is on. So again, this was the one that we used before, so it already has a set of UVs, so we have to make sure those are visible. So lists, UV maps, texture, they're all visible, ready to go. So let's just do a render, bake to render outputs and see what happens. So again, up here in the upper left-hand corner, it says baking, less than a minute left, and then it has your little percentage on there. And the other thing we can do is go into the zoom, set something like 100% so we can see this better. So if we look, this right here would be the bottom of the helicopter. This would be the helicopter blade. You can see, so the bottom blade dark, top blade light, the sides kind of a medium gray. Set that back to 50%. Okay, it's done. So let's take a look at this. So overall, we can see the darker areas are going to be the bottom portions of the helicopter. The lighter areas are going to be the top portions. But the other thing, just like in the last bake, if I click and hold on this, you can see it's a little bit darker than what it should be. So this guy's sRGB. This one I'm going to set to sRGB. And again, let's save out this image as LB for light bake. We'll just call this test. Save that as a PNG on the desktop. Let's go ahead and open that guy up. We're just going to compare it to this bake so we can see that, yes, the two match. They look the same because, again, I changed that lookup table. Well, I didn't change the lookup table. I changed the output color space to match the lookup table. So let's apply this as a texture and look at it. And again, at this point, I don't have AO final color or anything in there. It's all empty. So if I grab this and throw this in there. And the other thing is right now I have this set to default. That's going to show me the light that's going on in the scene. So let's go ahead and just change this to just flat texture. So if we look at this, we have this helicopter blade right here, and it's casting a shadow essentially, because this is where our light was, right all in this area. It's also casting a little bit of a shadow right here. But ignoring that part of it, let's look at the rest of this. So this one right here has a shadow that's getting cast. And then this, if I was to separate these two pieces out, this little in-between area right here is a little bit lighter. That's really not a big deal. We could touch that up if we wanted to. But now overall, we have an idea of what's going on with the light of this scene. Again, a little bit of weird stuff going on here. But if I look at my shadowy areas like this, I get that little grainy amount right there. So one of the things we're going to want to do is get rid of that grainy amount. Then the other thing I want to do is make it so my shadows aren't super hard. Just like when we're rendering stuff, we usually want to increase that spread angle. so we don't have super hard shadows. So in a helicopter, unless I planned on having this have a stripe right here, as soon as this blade starts spinning, what's going to happen is there's going to always be a shadow here, and it's going to kind of look bad. So let's go ahead and just leave this light bake test. We'll just turn it off. So let's look at what settings we have to change real quick. So we'll just jump back to the model tab. The first one's going to be the spread angle on those lights. This is a setting that we've seen in the past. So just click on the directional light. You're on this top little sidebar over here. Hit this little more button. And right here we have the spread angle. So it's currently set to 0. So we're going to increase that to 50 or 60. Let's just put it at 50. And then what we're going to need to do is do the same thing for this other light. So we click on directional light 2, more button, set that to 50 as well. And the other thing to take into consideration, if you kind of know what you're doing in this process, I can have my first light change all of its settings, and then when I duplicate it, the settings like the directional or the spread angle, those are going to just kind of copy over when you duplicate the light. So the other thing that we would need to look at changing would be that graininess that was happening in the shadowy area. So again, when I say graininess, I mean like kind of little speckles, like pixelation of black and white pixels as opposed to being like a smooth gray color or a smooth gradient. So what I'm going to do is just jump into the shading tree and look at this little blue render globe right here. And settings wise, we're going to look on these little side tabs. And what we want to look at is this little side guy right here called global illumination. And what this is again, this is just kind of the ambient light that's happening in the scene. So if I was to render the scene even with the lights off, this global illumination just subtly illuminates everything in the scene to where you're not in complete darkness. And by default, in all your scenes that you start, this will be enabled by default. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this irradiance samples right here. It's at 256. So it's going to take, the higher we increase this, the longer our render time is going to take, but the better the texture is going to look. So we'll put this to something like 4096. Just a significantly higher number, just so there's no graininess the next time we render this out. And as with kind of anything in Modo, there's a bunch of settings in here, and you can test these out a little bit. So this irradiance samples, just do a bake at 256, see how it looks, bump it up to 5,000, 10,000, whatever you want. Because a lot of this is just experimentation, kind of seeing what works and what doesn't. But we're going to put our samples to this. So the other thing, just as a quick reminder, if you needed to change your render size, right now we've been baking out our textures at a 1024 by 1024 or a 1K texture. But if I want to change this for whatever reason, I just have this blue render globe selected, hit frame. And again, this is going to be the same area that we change our render size as far as it rendering to the camera, but we're rendering to a texture. So we're going to hit this little more button, and then baking is right here. So bake width and bake height, we could increase this or decrease it depending on what we wanted for a texture size. So at this point, I'm just double checking. I have my UV map selected. Over here, we actually have final color on, so I want to turn final color off, turn the illumination total on, so that's going to be kind of what's rendering. So from here, what we're going to do is just do another render, bake to render outputs, but I'll actually speed this up so you don't have to see the whole process. It'll just kind of go quick. So now that that render is done, let's go ahead and save it out. So again, we want to make sure that our lookup table matches our render output. So set that to sRGB, hit save image. We'll just call this HELI for helicopter light bake. Save that to the desktop, and let's apply this and see what it looks like. So as we can see, if we look at the bottom, it's not nearly as grainy as it used to be. Same thing here, we're getting a little bit of subtle shadow right here, which we may or may not want, it just depends. And again, same thing in here, a little bit of graininess in here, but not a big deal. But overall, everything's looking pretty smooth. So let's look at what we could potentially do to kind of just touch this up manually. So what I'm going to do is jump into the Paint tab. And what we can do is potentially if these areas right here where it's a little bit lighter would cause issue, what you could always do is just grab your smudge brush and kind of like bring these parts up just a little bit. You could also just color match it, so you grab your airbrush, color pick, and just darken these areas if that's bothering you. Again, you could do the same thing inside of Photoshop. But the other thing that you could technically do if you wanted to would be kind of just manipulate the mesh before you bake and then change it back. So what I mean when I say that is we can manipulate the mesh by just grabbing parts of it. So we could grab this part, move it up quite a bit, and as soon as it's a good distance away, the light's looking from right here, so it's going to cast a shadow, and it's never going to cast a shadow from this blade onto the top of our asset here. So let's just move that back down so it's in place. So what you can do so you don't have to worry about moving everything back down is I have my helicopter LB mesh right here. I could just grab everything. Oops, I'm going to grab its polygons, copy, new mesh, paste. Let's turn this one off, and I'll just rename this one HELI for LB, so helicopter for light bake. So now this one I can go ahead and I can edit in any way that I see fit. And the UVs are going to stay in the same spot. So I can move everything apart, do the bake, save out that texture, and then apply the bake to this correct version of the mesh. So other things I could do, so let's just look at this, where we said we were going to smudge it to fix it. So again, smudging it gives me this result. Everything looks really, really clean, but maybe I don't want to sit here and smudge every one of these corners. So I could grab this little piece right here and just move it down a little bit. So what that's going to do is that's going to expose this portion of it, so it's going to bake, and then there'd be potentially a little white line right here. But then when we grab it and move it back up, or aka use our correct mesh, this mesh, all that stuff's going to kind of be moved back where it needs to. So same thing with this. Let's say these little guys right here weren't here, so we'll just hit H to hide those. So this little turret thing, whatever it is, little missile pod guy, this could potentially, oops, grab the right axis, could rotate on this little guy. So as soon as I rotate it out, realistically there wouldn't be a need for a shadow right here because this guy right here would technically be casting a shadow here. So I wouldn't want baked shadows in right here. So that could be something that, just undoing this real quick, I could grab this whole missile pod, and probably I'd want to do this on both sides. And I could just move this down, and then when I did my light bake, you can see that it's really not interacting with this stuff, so I wouldn't get any shadow from this helicopter onto the light bake here. And it might even be the same thing with this turret right here, because if this was to look, oh, we would want to rotate it from the correct spot. If we rotated it up, maybe we wouldn't want it to be really dark right here. If we rotated it down, we wouldn't want this darkness right here. So we could just grab this guy and pull it out this way. So again, now you can think of it as this is kind of an exploded view. Oops, let me grab everything. And we'll just turn symmetry on. Make sure we grab all these parts. So this is an exploded view, and we only do this for the light bake, because again, for the ambient occlusion, we want to make sure that this portion is close to this portion. So this is just one of those scenarios that you can kind of test out, see what you need to explode from other parts, and then kind of go from there. So again, this is just something that the more you kind of mess around with it, the more experience you get, the better bakes you're going to get overall. Let's turn this guy back on. So again, I can come in here, and maybe I just don't want to rebake this out, so I can just grab an airbrush, low opacity, and just come in and paint that out. So again, these are just black and white maps, so manipulating them can be relatively easy, but again, when you get what you want, go over here, find your one. So this was this guy, hit save. I really don't need these ones, so I can delete these. These are just kind of the test ones that I was doing, and then the previous bake that we did. So now this guy is saved and ready to go. So let's jump into Photoshop and edit this. So in Photoshop, let's actually look at our previous texture that we made. So again, these are the base colors, and then this is that alternate ambient occlusion that we baked out. This is the ambient occlusion set to a multiply. So again, this one was a black and white texture. So this one, we're just going to discard this. We want to do it this way, where kind of all of our colors stay where we want them. So with this process, we're going to do that same thing where we take all the black out of the image, but then we're going to do an additional step. So let's go ahead and just get the black out of the image real quick. So we can grab all of our geometry, channels, grab all of our pixels, channels, new, paste. And we want all the blacks. We're going to Control I to invert, Control click. We'll grab all the white pixels, which were technically black, new layer, fill with black. So again, I did that kind of fast. If you need to jump back to the old video, you definitely can. So this we're going to call LB for light bake black. So let's grab this and go ahead and put it over on this layer. So again, this one, just like this, I'll set to a soft light. And again, let's turn this one off. So this is kind of what's happening at this point. So the bottom of this helicopter quite a bit darker, the top quite a bit lighter. So realistically, this one we'll probably want to tone this down, so drop its opacity. But let's just look at it as is and apply it. So HELI diff test. We'll just throw that on the desktop. And let's apply it as a texture. Oops. So again, from here, there's no AO. This is just the helicopter itself. So again, from here, what we're getting is lighter on the top, darker on the bottom, and that's just naturally doing that from our light bake. So let's take this black level and take it down to, let's do like 60%, so it's not as intense. So let's go back to here. Let's just get our undo history and kind of undo all this so we're back to normal. The other thing I'm going to do is just fill this with white, just so it's a complete filled texture. So now what I want to do is we got the black from the AO bake. We got the black from the light bake. So both of these are the black ones. So now what we want to do is something a little bit different. We want to grab the white from the light bake. So this one we don't have to do that invert process. We just grab all the pixels, copy, channels, new, paste, hold Control, tap on this little thumbnail image, layers, new layer, and then I just want to fill this layer with white. So Control backspace or layer fill, whatever you want to do. So now if I deselect this, this is just all the white from that image. So let's grab this, put it over here. So now this one, again, this one's going to look really intense. I'm going to set this one to an overlay. So now it's really, really hot. We obviously don't want it that intense. So let's drop it to something like 20%, and then I can toggle it on and off and kind of see what it's doing. So from here, we have, let's go ahead and name this LB for light bake, and we'll put light. So just so this makes sense, we'll actually change this to LB dark instead of black. So we have our base colors, our ambient occlusion set to multiply, the white of our light bake set to overlay and at about 20%, give or take, and then the black of our light bake set to soft light, and we have it at about 60%. And again, these values you can change around as much as you want. Let's go ahead and save this as a PNG, and we'll just call it just that same thing. We'll name over it helicopter diffuse test. Yes, I want to replace it. And we'll just reload image. So now if we look at this, what's happening here is we have just kind of a subtle difference in texture all over the place. So there's just a lot of subtleties going on, like it being a little bit darker up in here, that makes this feel like it's almost partially lit without having technically done any painting whatsoever yet. So again, this is just a really, really cool method for getting started on textures. And then from here you can go in and put panel lines and paint your character's skin and do all that other stuff. But this is just a really cool starting point. So as far as working in these textures go, what I like to do is these 3 layers, I like to keep these on top. So the base color's on the bottom. So then my paint layers would be in here. So panel lines or whatever we're going to make. So for here, I can go in, start making panel lines. Let's actually do this as a different color. So as I start putting these in, if I go into a darker area, it's going to automatically stay darker. If I go into a lighter area, it's going to stay lighter. So as long as I'm painting below these 3 layers, but above the base color, I can go in and kind of mix this up as much as I want, and all the lighting is going to stay intact. I usually don't want to paint above these. I mean, you definitely could. It just depends on kind of where you're at with painting. But same thing here. If I was going to potentially start painting on this helicopter guy, I would probably change a bunch of brush settings. Let's just switch to a soft brush. But I can start coming in here and painting the shadows that would come from this little lip that would come up. Maybe switch to a lighter color. And this would be kind of where the highlight on this little edge would be, and I'd want to ideally make these, whoa, that's a big brush, a little bit straighter, but I can go in with the erase brush and clean those up. So again, something like that, to where this starts to read a little bit better, like there's actually some more depth going in here. And again, this is just kind of your normal painting scenario where you go in and start painting stuff, but as long as we're painting under, again, these 3 layers, all of this kind of magic that's happening with these layers is going to continue to happen. The other thing it's going to let us do is potentially modify these layers. So again, I have my light bake light. Maybe that's a little bit too hot. I can tone it down to 10-15% and just see what it's doing there. Same thing with this. Maybe this guy's a little bit too dark and I'm not liking it. So again, just having all these layers lets me kind of adjust this however I want. And then I can go in and kind of finish the textures overall. So again, this is just a cool thing that's not required for all your assignments, but it's definitely one of those things that if you're not really good at texturing yet, having these quote-unquote helper maps that help you they help you to get things to kind of look pretty good without actually having to do anything. You're just going in and clicking on settings and everything's kind of procedural. It's just, again, just a really easy way to make your textures look a little bit better. So again, feel free to use this on assignments. It's definitely something I'll be looking for and kind of throwing some bonus points your way if you go through all these extra steps. But again, it just makes your textures look a lot nicer without having to think about all the things like lighting and whatnot and taking all that stuff into consideration.